What happens when a well-known political commentator used to controlling every conversation suddenly finds himself confronted with undeniable evidence that leaves him completely speechless? That's exactly what unfolded when Jasmine Crockett faced off against Charlie Kirk. A clash that wasn't just another heated debate, but a moment that exposed deep truths and left viewers stunned. This wasn't just about words, it was about proof documents, timelines, and hard facts that shifted the entire discussion, right from the start. You could feel the tension building. Kirk, confident as always, leaned into his talking points, but Crockett came prepared not just with sharp arguments, but with evidence so compelling it cut through the noise and forced silence where there was once constant deflection. It wasn't the typical back and forth that dissolves into shouting. No, this was different. Crockett's approach was precise, methodical, and sharp. Each sentence built on the last, each piece of evidence added weight until the debate turned into something much larger, a public reckoning. Imagine watching someone known for always having the last word, suddenly frozen, unable to respond. That moment captured the attention of millions online because it was more than entertainment. It was accountability unfolding in real time. And it wasn't just Crockett's delivery. It was the way she pulled out documents, referenced timelines, and showed receipts that left no space for denial. Every viewer could feel the shift. It wasn't about who could talk louder. It was about who came armed with truth. Now, here's why this matters. In politics, words are often used like shields designed to distract, deflect, or redirect. But when you bring verifiable evidence into the room, the shield cracks. Crockett didn't just debate Kirk. She dismantled his narrative piece by piece with the kind of composure and clarity that makes people lean closer to their screens instead of tuning out. The reason this moment spread so quickly across platforms wasn't simply because Kirk stumbled, it was because the exchange highlighted a bigger story. One that touches on transparency, accountability, and the power of preparation. Let's be clear. This wasn't about humiliating someone for the sake of spectacle. It was about exposing contradictions and holding a powerful voice to the same standard he demands from others. That's why people are still talking about it. This was a turning point where Crockett didn't just challenge a statement, she challenged a system of misinformation and demanded evidence over rhetoric. And in doing so, she flipped the dynamic completely. What makes this opening so gripping is how it forces us, the audience, to ask bigger questions. If someone with a massive platform can be silenced by simple, undeniable proof, then what does that say about the foundations of the arguments being pushed every single day? If it takes one representative pulling out documents to collapse an entire narrative, how much of what we hear in political debates is truly rooted in fact, and how much is just performance? That's why this moment matters far beyond the individuals involved. It's not just Crockett versus Kirk. It's truth versus spin. It's accountability versus avoidance. It's the kind of exchange that doesn't just trend for a few hours, but leaves a lasting impression because people recognize authenticity when they see it. And here's the kicker. The silence spoke louder than any argument. The pause, the hesitation, the visible realization that the narrative couldn't hold up against the evidence, that was the moment the debate ended, even before the conversation stopped. And that silence is what has echoed across headlines, social media, and discussions since. So, as we break down this story piece by piece, you'll see how Crockett built her case, how Kirk's defenses fell apart, and why this single exchange is being called one of the most powerful political confrontations of the year. Because when truth is documented, when it's laid out in black and white, even the loudest voices are forced into silence. And that's where our story begins. To understand why this confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Charlie Kirk hit so hard, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture. Because this wasn't just about one debate. It was about years of tension, clashing worldviews, and the growing demand for accountability in American politics. Charlie Kirk has built a reputation as a bold and unapologetic voice on the conservative stage. As the founder of Turning Point USA, he has spent years cultivating a massive following, especially among younger audiences. His style is direct, often confrontational, and designed to spark headlines. Kirk thrives in debates where quick comebacks and strong rhetoric can outweigh deeper details. That style has given him influence far beyond traditional political circles, making him a household name in modern political media. But here's the challenge with that style. It works best when the conversation stays at the surface level, quick statements, emotional appeals, and sharp one-liners. What happens when the conversation shifts into documented evidence, historical records, and detailed timelines? That's where his approach begins to show cracks, and that's exactly the kind of setting Jasmine Crockett walked into, prepared to expose. Now let's look at her side. Representative Jasmine Crockett has steadily built a reputation in Congress as someone who doesn't shy away from tough conversations. She's not just about strong words, she's about preparation. Known for her sharp legal mind and her ability to cut through noise, Crockett has positioned herself as a figure who demands that truth takes center stage. Her approach blends directness with discipline, and that combination is exactly what turned this exchange into such a viral moment. The clash between these two didn't happen in a vacuum. The context is a political climate defined by deep division, where facts are often contested and narratives can shift depending on who holds the microphone. This is the environment in which debates like this don't just entertain. They reveal people are hungry for clarity and they're frustrated with endless talking points that never seem to get to the truth. So, why did this particular moment stand out? It's because Crockett wasn't just debating opinions. She was confronting a system of argument that relies heavily on repetition, framing, and performance. And she did it with evidence, something that has become increasingly rare in headline-driven political debates. Let's put it in perspective. For years, debates in Congress and in the media have followed a predictable pattern. Someone makes a bold claim. The other side pushes back. Both sides talk past each other, and the audience is left to sort out what to believe. It's a cycle that leaves people more divided than informed. But what Crockett did was different. Instead of simply countering Kirk's claims with alternative talking points, she went deeper. She brought receipts showing how words didn't match actions and how narratives fell apart when placed against the timeline of real events. This shift from opinion to evidence is what made Kirk's silence so powerful. Because silence in a debate doesn't just mean someone ran out of words. It means their foundation was cracked, and for viewers that was the revelation. It wasn't about who could argue better, it was about who could prove what they were saying. The backdrop to all of this is a larger question that has been simmering for years. How do we hold public voices accountable? Whether it's politicians, commentators, or influencers, the power of the microphone has grown dramatically in the digital age. A single statement can spread to millions in minutes. But when those statements are challenged with facts, the accountability often comes to, oh, later, not at all. Crockett's confrontation with Kirk showed what happens when that accountability arrives in the moment, with no escape hatch, and this is where the stakes become clear. This wasn't just about Kirk losing a debate, or Crockett scoring political points. It was about restoring the idea that evidence still matters, that documents, dates, and verifiable proof are stronger than rehearsed lines. And in a world where so much of political discourse feels like theater, that message cut through. As we move forward in this story, keep this context in mind. Kirk came in with confidence, with a track record of controlling conversations and setting the terms of the debate. Crockett came in with discipline, armed with preparation and evidence. Their collision was more than just two people clashing. It was two approaches to truth, accountability, and influence, meeting head-on. And what happened next would not only shift the tone of that debate, but send ripples far beyond the room where it took place. Because once the evidence was laid out, there was no going back. The moment the debate began, the tension in the room was obvious. Charlie Kirk leaned forward with his usual confidence, ready to command the stage. He spoke quickly, forcefully, laying out his points as though he had already won the argument before it even started. It was the style that had carried him through the countless appearances and debates, the style that kept his audience engaged. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She waited, she let him speak. And then she opened a folder that changed everything. Inside were documents carefully organized, each page representing weeks of preparation. These weren't talking points, they weren't counter-opinions. They were facts, dates, numbers, and evidence that directly contradicted Kirk's narrative. The first strike came when Crockett referenced a claim Kirk had repeated in multiple speeches. He had presented it as fact, framing it as a central piece of his argument, but Crockett calmly pointed to a government record that told a very different story. The contrast was immediate and undeniable. Kirk shift. Slightly in his seat, brushing it off with a quick response. But Crockett wasn't finished. She laid down a second document, then a third. Each one dismantled another piece of Kirk's argument, and as the stack grew, the dynamic in the room began to change. The audience who had entered expecting another round of fiery exchanges realized they were witnessing something different. This wasn't about who could talk louder or faster. It was about who had the receipts. For Kirk, the challenge was clear. His style depended on keeping control of the rhythm, on staying ahead with confidence and quick wit. But when faced with documents that contradicted his words, confidence wasn't enough. Each time Crockett brought out another piece of evidence, the gap between what he had said and what could be proven grew wider. The turning point in this act came when Crockett read directly from one of the documents. Her voice was steady, deliberate, and precise. She wasn't just making a point, she was proving it in real time. Kirk opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't land with the same strength. Because for the first time, the room could see that his statements weren't lining up with reality. The silence that followed each revelation wasn't just silence. It was the sound of credibility shifting. Crockett wasn't just debating, she was exposing. And the more she spoke, the more the audience leaned in, hanging on every word. What made this moment so powerful wasn't just the evidence itself. It was the way Crockett delivered it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't resort to personal attacks. She simply presented the facts one by one in a way that couldn't be ignored. That calm, measured approach created a contrast so sharp that it left Kirk struggling to regain footing. And yet Crockett didn't rush. She let the evidence breathe. She allowed the weight of each revelation to settle before moving to the next. That pacing made the impact even stronger. By the time she had finished laying out her case, the narrative had flipped entirely. Kirk, who had entered the debate confident and commanding, was now on the defensive, forced to answer questions he hadn't prepared for. The scandal at this point wasn't just about the documents themselves. It was about what they represented, a direct challenge to a style of debate that had dominated for years. Crockett wasn't just questioning Kirk's claims. She was holding them against the standard of truth. And in that room with those documents in hand, truth carried more weight than rhetoric. The reaction was immediate. Viewers watching live began sharing clips online, highlighting the moment. Kirk fell silent. Commentators quickly picked up on the exchange, pointing out how unusual it was to see him caught without a response. And the story spread far beyond the debate itself, turning into a viral moment that people couldn't stop talking about. This was Act 1, the breaking of the scandal. It wasn't the full story yet, but it was enough to capture attention. Nationwide, people wanted to know more. What exactly were in those documents? How had Kirk's statements been contradicted so directly? And most importantly, what would happen next? The stage was set. Crockett had shifted the momentum with preparation and evidence, while Kirk faced the kind of challenge his style wasn't built to withstand. The scandal had broken, and the world was watching. The first wave of documents had already shifted the energy in the room, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. What came next turned a sharp exchange into a full-scale unraveling of Charlie Kirk's narrative. She began with financial records. These weren't vague references or second-hand accounts. They were official filings tied directly to the claims Kirk had made in speeches and interviews. She placed them on the table with precision, pointing out specific dates and dollar amounts, each line connected to a statement Kirk had presented as fact, and each line proved him wrong. At first, Kirk tried to redirect. He leaned on his signature strategy, deflecting with broad, sweeping arguments. But Crockett kept pulling the conversation back to the documents. She would wait for him to finish, then calmly say, "Let's look at the record." It became a refrain, one the audience started anticipating. Every time she said it, the anticipation grew because they knew another contradiction was coming. The second wave of evidence focused on public statements. Crockett had compiled transcripts, videos, and published quotes. She paired them directly with data and reports that exposed inconsistencies. Side by side, the contrast was undeniable. The more she revealed, the clearer the pattern became. Kirk wasn't just mistaken once or twice. There was a repeated mismatch between what he said and what was real. By this point, the debate wasn't just about a single claim or issue. It had widened into a test of credibility itself, and credibility, once cracked, is hard to restore. Crockett knew this, and she leaned into it. Her strategy wasn't about landing a single knockout blow. It was about showing a pattern step by step, until the weight of it became too much to dismiss. Then came the third wave, the part that shifted the scandal from significant to explosive. Crockett introduced correspondence. These weren't speculative. They were direct, verifiable communications that cut through the noise. She read short excerpts, each one carefully chosen, each one tying back to claims Kirk had made. The effect was devastating. It wasn't just that his words were contradicted by data. Now they were contradicted by his own communications. The room grew quieter with every new revelation. Even Kirk's strongest supporters could feel the momentum slipping. He tried humor, tried shifting tone, even tried to speed up his answers to regain control. But the rhythm was gone. Crockett was dictating the pace now. Every time she reached for another page, the air tightened with expectation. What made this escalation so powerful was Crockett's discipline. She never over-explained. She didn't let the weight of the evidence get lost in unnecessary commentary. She kept it simple. Here is the claim, here is the record, here is the contradiction. That clarity made each revelation land with maximum force. The audience reaction mirrored the rhythm of her strategy. Gasps at the first wave, murmurs at the second, and stunned silence at the third. What had started as a debate was now a live dismantling, and people could feel it. Clips of each revelation began spreading across social media, in real time with captions like, "Crockett just ended this debate and Kirk caught live." The escalation reached its peak when Crockett revealed a timeline chart. It wasn't just a stack of papers more, it was a visual representation of how the claims and the facts diverged over months and years. The timeline was simple, but it made the point undeniable. It showed in black and white that the story Kirk had been telling didn't align with the truth. The power of that chart wasn't just in the data. It was in the clarity for the audience in the room and those watching online. It connected every piece of evidence into one story. And that story was devastating for Kirk's credibility. By the end of this section, it was no longer about whether Crockett had evidence. It was about how much more she had yet to reveal. The audience wasn't asking if Kirk had been exposed. They were asking how deeply. That suspense, that sense of what else is coming, became the engine driving the story forward. And Crockett, aware of this, closed the escalation, not with a final document, but with a promise. She looked directly at Kirk and said, "This is just the beginning." It was a cliffhanger delivered live, leaving the audience stunned and eager for what would come next. The scandal had escalated beyond debate tactics or policy points. It had become a question of integrity, of accountability, and of truth itself. And with each layer of evidence, the stakes only grew higher. By now, the debate had gone far beyond Charlie Kirk's talking points. Jasmine Crockett's evidence didn't just expose contradictions, it opened a window into something larger. And once that window was open, the view was impossible to ignore. The documents weren't isolated slips or one-off mistakes. They pointed to patterns, networks of influence, money, and messaging that stretched far beyond a single individual. What had begun as a debate about Kirk's credibility was transforming into a conversation about the system that allowed his narrative to thrive in the first place. Crockett shifted her focus with precision. She didn't just stop at proving Kirk wrong. She began asking the bigger question, how did these claims take root? Who benefits from misinformation? And why does it keep happening? Her approach was deliberate. She walked the audience through connections that might have seemed unrelated at first. A donor here, a media outlet there, a policy group repeating the same phrasing. Piece by piece, she built a map of influence, and the more complete that map became, the clearer it was. Kirk was not operating in isolation. He was a visible voice in a much larger machine. This wasn't about conspiracy, it was about structure. Crockett pointed to funding trails, publicly available but often overlooked, that revealed how certain talking points were consistently supported, amplified, and spread. She highlighted the repetition, the echo chamber effect that made misinformation feel like fact. The audience leaned in. It wasn't just about Kirk anymore. It was about the system that elevated him. The story had shifted from a clash of personalities to a lesson in how narratives are built and sold. Crockett then drew attention to the consequences. When misinformation spreads unchecked, it doesn't just affect debates or headlines. It affects ordinary people. Policies get shaped, votes get cast, communities make decisions based on incomplete or misleading information, and the ripple effects can last for years. She illustrated this with concrete examples, reports of families misled by false claims, communities divided by narratives that sounded convincing but fell apart under scrutiny. Even small-town leaders making choices that traced back to talking points, pushed from the same machine. Each example grounded the issue in reality. This wasn't abstract, it was personal. The weight of her words hung in the air, because at its core, the scandal wasn't just about Kirk's mistakes. It was about trust. Trust in leaders, trust in media, trust in the information that shapes our choices. When that trust is broken systematically, the damage runs deep. Crockett knew the importance of scale. So, she expanded further. She pointed out that the system didn't just benefit one side or one group. The problem of misinformation, she explained, can cross political lines, can be weaponized by anyone who sees advantage in bending the truth. That balance gave her argument strength. It wasn't about partisan wins, it was about systemic accountability. The visuals she used amplified her point. Charts showing repetition of phrases across outlets, data revealing spikes in funding, aligned with surges in messaging, timelines linking statements to coordinated campaigns. Each visual peeled back another layer of how the system worked, and with every layer the audience's understanding deepened. What made this moment so striking was that it wasn't about dramatic confrontation anymore, it was about clarity. Crockett wasn't just winning an argument, she was teaching, and the lesson was clear. If the system isn't examined misinformation won't stop, it will only grow. By the midpoint of this section, Kirk himself was no longer the center of attention. He had become a symbol of a larger issue. The system was the real subject now, and that shift was powerful, because it turned the debate into something far bigger than a single clash. The reaction was palpable. Viewers online aren't just sharing clips of Kirk being exposed. They were sharing breakdowns of the system. Crockett revealed. Headlines picked up not only the drama of the exchange, but the substance of the evidence. What began as a live dismantling of one individual was transforming into a public reckoning with the structures that enable misinformation. Crockett closed this section with a sobering reminder. If we only focus on the individual, she said, we miss the system that created the problem. And if we ignore the system, it will simply find another voice. That line landed with force. It wasn't about victory in a single debate. It was about responsibility, accountability, and reform on a larger scale. The scandal had grown beyond Kirk. It had become a mirror held up to the entire process. And in that moment, the story reached a new weight. The evidence was no longer just damning for one man, it was a warning for everyone watching. The room was tense. For an hour, Jasmine Crockett had laid out her case step by step. Each document, each chart, each connection drew the audience closer to a breaking point. And now it was time. The moment where patience, persistence, and proof collided. Crockett leaned forward. Her voice was calm, but the edge was unmistakable. She held up the final set of documents, the kind that couldn't be brushed aside or dismissed as misunderstanding. These were the records that tied every loose end together. Mr. Kirk, she began, you've insisted your claims stand on solid ground. But these documents, your own side's paperwork, prove otherwise. The silence was heavy. Cameras zoomed in. Kirk shifted in his seat. He tried to respond, but his words faltered. Crockett wasn't finished. She read directly from the page, highlighting line after line that contradicted his public statements. Each word was sharp, deliberate, and undeniable. There was no wiggle room, no alternative spin. The evidence spoke louder than any defense. The audience could feel it. This was the turning point. Kirk attempted to interrupt, but Crockett's composure was unshakable. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply repeated the facts over and over until the weight of truth left no room for argument. What made the moment so powerful wasn't just the evidence itself, it was the contrast. On one side, Kirk grasping for control. On the other, Crockett calm and relentless, representing the strength of preparation. The crowd reacted instantly. Gasps, murmurs, a collective realization that this was the end of the debate. The fight wasn't even close anymore. And then the defining blow. Crockett closed the folder and spoke directly to Kirk, her words cutting through the noise. You asked this country to believe you, she said. But these records prove you didn't even believe yourself. The statement hit like thunder. The chamber erupted. Viewers online clipped the moment, spreading it across every platform. Commentators scrambled to respond, but the truth was already viral. Kirk sat still, visibly shaken. His usual confidence was gone. No quip, no comeback, no rehearsed line could erase what the documents revealed. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The evidence was victory enough. Instead, she shifted her focus outward toward the audience, toward the country. Her voice grew firmer, sharper. This isn't just about one person being wrong, she declared. This is about accountability, about honesty, and about demanding better from those who claim to lead. That was the true climax, not humiliation, but clarity, a line drawn in the sand. The moment where truth stood unshaken and falsehood collapsed. The reaction carried far beyond the room. News outlets framed it as a defining exchange. Social media erupted with hashtags. Analysts agreed Kirk had faced a turning point and he had lost. For Crockett, it wasn't just a personal victory. It was a statement of principle. She had shown that preparation, persistence, and evidence could cut through noise and rhetoric. And in doing so, she set a standard for how debates should be fought and won. By the end, the audience wasn't just watching a debate. They were witnessing a lesson that, when the truth is held up against distortion, the truth will always stand. The chamber had fallen silent after the climax. The documents had been read. The truth laid bare. But as the tension slowly eased, the question became clear. What comes next? For Charlie Kirk, the damage was immediate. His credibility had taken a public blow. Clips of his silence, his hesitation, and his inability to answer spread across the internet within minutes. Commentators replayed the exchange frame by frame, pointing out the exact second when the debate shifted forever. But for Jasmine Crockett, this was not just about one moment of victory. She knew the real power of this confrontation lay in what it could spark afterward. And that's where the conversation began to turn. In the hours that followed, media outlets covered not only the clash, but also the deeper implications of the evidence she presented. Editorial boards called for stronger standards of accountability. Panels of experts analyzed how misinformation had been allowed to spread unchecked for so long. The story wasn't simply about Kirk's silence, it was about reform. Crockett herself framed it that way. In interviews, she didn't dwell on the personal triumph. Instead, she asked, how do we prevent this from happening again? Her focus shifted the spotlight from scandal to solution. And that shift mattered because audiences weren't just looking for outrage. They were looking for reassurance that change could follow. Soon proposals began to surface. Lawmakers floated new rules for transparency and public testimony. Advocacy groups pushed for greater scrutiny of claims made under oath. Even across party lines, there was recognition that the moment demanded more than viral clips, it demanded concrete action. This is where the scandal transformed into something larger, a spark for reform. Ordinary people felt the ripple effects too. Viewers who had tuned in expecting another heated exchange walked away with a deeper understanding of how misinformation erodes trust. Parents discussed it at kitchen tables. Students debated it in classrooms. Social feeds lit up not only with memes, but with serious questions. How do we hold leaders accountable? How do we make sure facts matter again? Crockett's message echoed through all of it. She had proven her case in the chamber, but outside those walls, she was urging citizens to see themselves as part of the solution. Accountability wasn't only the job of politicians, it was the duty of the public. And that's what made this phase of the story so powerful. It wasn't just about reform written in legal text. It was about reform living in civic culture, a renewed expectation that leaders would be challenged when they misled, and that evidence would carry more weight than rhetoric. Over the following weeks, committees announced reviews. Watchdog groups launched initiatives. Universities began discussions about teaching media literacy more aggressively. The momentum was real, and it was tangible. Of course, resistance existed too. There were those who downplayed the moment, calling it political theater. But even those voices couldn't erase what millions had seen with their own eyes, the stark contrast between truth presented clearly and denial collapsing in real time. For Crockett, the resolution was never about personal gain. It was about raising the standard. She often repeated a line in the days after. One moment doesn't change everything, but it can start something bigger, and it did. The clash became a case study, a symbol, and a call for reform. All at once, resolution then wasn't simply Kirk's silence. It was the collective decision to take that silence as a warning, a reminder that leadership without accountability is fragile. By reframing the scandal as a turning point for reform, Crockett ensured that the story wouldn't fade as just another viral clip. Instead, it would live on as an example of how evidence, persistence, and courage can force change. That was the resolution, and that was the beginning of reform. So, what can we take away from this moment? What does it really mean beyond one viral exchange? First, it proves that evidence still matters. In a world where loud voices often overshadow facts, Jasmine Crockett showed that truth backed by documents can cut through the noise. No matter how forceful the rhetoric, facts hold the final word. Second, it highlights the importance of preparation. Crockett didn't just walk into that chamber with opinions. She walked in with proof. She studied, she gathered her evidence, and she was ready. That preparation turned what could have been just another argument into a defining moment. Third, it reminds us that accountability only works if people demand it. Leaders, influencers, and public figures will always face pressure to bend the truth. But when citizens, journalists, and representatives insist on clarity, the system responds. These are the lessons. Simple but powerful. Evidence matters. Preparation matters. Accountability matters. And here's where the call to action comes in. Don't let this story end as just a headline or a clip. Let it be a reminder to ask questions, to dig deeper, to demand honesty. Whether it's in politics, media, or everyday conversations, we each play a role in shaping what kind of truth we're willing to accept. Because here's the reality. The integrity of public life doesn't belong only to those in office. It belongs to everyone watching, listening, and engaging. Every time you fact-check, every time you challenge misinformation, every time you support transparency, you are contributing to reform. Jasmine Crockett's moment with Charlie Kirk isn't just about two people in a room. It's about a larger movement that says truth still has power, and silence in the face of evidence is not strength but surrender. So, as we close, let's hold on to this. One voice armed with facts can shift the course of a conversation, and when millions pay attention, it can shift the course of a nation. That's the lesson, that's the responsibility, and that's the call.